well, good morning, and thank you all so much for joining us. Again, my name is Robert Hayes. I'm the Community Outreach Librarian and Head of Technical Services here at the Tewksbury Public Library. Want to thank the Andover and Groton Libraries for joining us this morning. This morning's presentation is entitled Art in the Year 1000 AD. Now that we're firmly established in the new millennium, let's take a look back to study the artistic developments, religious expressions, and technical achievements of a number of cultures that were active 1,000 years ago. Our tour will take us from Africa to the Islamic world, Asia, Europe, and the Americas. Along the way, we will begin to discover just how much contact and influence these cultures had on one another. Let's see, hope you're comfy.
That's right.
I think I probably should have put a period there, not a comma, but that's okay. You know, I probably wrote that 2 months ago, so I should have caught that before now. We will cover a lot of ground during our armchair journey back through time to the year 1000 AD. So this talk is led by art historian Mary Woodward, who serves as a guide at several historic New England properties. She previously served as public programs coordinator and educator at the Concord Museum. Mary has a BA in art history from Furman University and an MA in art history from Emory University. She has more than 40 years of experience in museums of all shapes and sizes, from the comprehensive collection at the Cleveland Museum of Art to the one-room log cabin birthplace of President James K. Polk. And I believe this is Mary's 5th virtual talk here with the Tewksbury Library. So let's give a big virtual round of applause to Mary for once again joining us this morning. And Mary, you can take it away. Thanks so much.
All right. Thank you so much. Thank you, Robert, and the Friends of Tewksbury Library, and our friends joining us from Andover, Groton, and all the other places you listed. It's a pleasure to be with you this morning. As he said, it's a romp around the world today, so we've got a lot of ground to cover. One way to look at the subject is through the lens of globalization. Trade routes took shape all over the world that allowed goods, technologies, religions, people, and diseases to leave home and go somewhere new in the year 1000. What caused this globalization? Why do we find so much happening around this year? It was a surplus in agriculture that led to a population growth and allowed some of the people to stop farming full-time and to produce goods and become merchants. Farmers learned to plant new crops that offered twice as many harvests. Some learned to increase yield through a system of crop rotation. These changes produced profound results. How many people were alive in the year 1,000 years ago? The estimate is about 250 million. Divided that way, about 50% of them in Asia, 20% in Europe, 20% in Africa, and about 10% of that population in the Americas. And how are we going to know what it was like back then? Well, first of all, there's plenty still standing today in our world around us that was built around the year 1000. If you've visited Dublin, Oslo, Kiev, which is not a place we would want to go to right now, unfortunately, Samarkand, Istanbul, or Timbuktu, you've been in a place that was a thriving city in the year 1000. Many travel hotspots today were at their peak of development in the year 1000. The Tower of London up there at the top, or St. Mark's in Venice on the bottom. And of course, there are written records and artifacts to study as well as buildings. And surprisingly, perhaps, there's another source of information about the world of 1000, poetry, which some scholars believe remains the soundest evidence we have. Why is that? Poems and oral histories have a rhythm and a meter so that they're less susceptible to change over the years as they're repeated. Now, to be clear, it wasn't the year 1000 for everyone. In the Jewish calendar, it was 4760. To the Buddhists, the year was 1544. The Chinese looked at their calendars and it said 3696. And in the Islamic world, the year was 390. As we visit each location today, we'll take a look at the goods they traded, their art, their technology, their religion. And we'll take advantage of some maps during our trip. That seems like pretty good advice to me. We'll start our trip around the world in the area with the highest population in the year 1000. Not surprisingly, it still has the highest population, Asia. In 1000, there may have been as many as 125 million people living in Asia. The years we're going to study today saw some of the most brilliant decades in Chinese history, for instance, but it was already an ancient civilization by the year 1000. How is it possible for the population to grow so large? The one easy answer, again, is food. There was a boon to food production. For instance, in the year 1012, a new variety of rice was available. That meant 2 harvests a year. The Chinese were importing these items, things like incense, ivory, ebony, pearls, gemstones, spices, coconuts, and other tropical fruits from as far away as India, Africa, the Middle East, and Europe. And what were they exporting? Well, the list should sound familiar, as these are still items we associate with Asia: silk, tea, and porcelain. High temperature kilns could hold as many as 30,000 vessels per firing. The kaolin clay and other ingredients that the Chinese used for their pottery produced shiny, easy to clean, strong ceramics that were in demand all over the world. And we know them as porcelain, and we nickname all nice dishes China because of it, don't we? Song period, this is from the Northern Song Dynasty. Song period potters achieved a technical and aesthetic perfection that was made their wares the models of excellence throughout the world. As one author says, they are quietly beautiful pieces. This period also witnessed the flowering of another of the supreme artistic expressions of Chinese civilization, monumental landscape painting. And one of the greatest treasures of Chinese art is this hanging scroll. It's by a man named Fang Guan, and you see his name there. And he's Northern Song Dynasty's greatest landscape painter. Our journey begins with the rocks in the foreground, and then we're meant to look in the middle ground, the light area here. And I've blown up a detail of the travelers right there on that path there. And we're meant to see how tiny people are compared to nature as you move through the expanse of the painting all the way up. One author wrote, the whole painting then conveys the feeling of climbing a high mountain, leaving the human world behind as another and coming face to face with some ultimate truth. Now, a word on Chinese technology in the year 1000. The Chinese had been making paper for at least 400 years by that point. By the year 1000, printed books were common, and many of them survive today. The Chinese built vast libraries, schools, and hospitals by that point. They made discoveries in mining and metallurgy. By 904, they were using gunpowder, exploding grenades, rockets, and mortars. By 1044, they had learned how to make flamethrowers. They led everyone else in the world in technology. Now, tellingly, as we go back to the map here and talk about globalization in the world of 1000, the Japanese over here had only one port open to foreign merchant ships compared to China's many ports. The Japanese were importing these types of things: glass vessels and brass pots from the Middle East, rock crystal objects from India, and amber from the Baltic region, more than 4,000 miles away. Japan was influenced by many of the Chinese developments, but they forged an independent path. Japan's society and government were quite different from China's. Japan was led by local clans rather than a centralized government. And they had no army in Japan because they had no enemies to speak of. At the time that we're looking at today, Japan had a weak emperor in a court full of intrigue. And it's that palace intrigue that was the setting for one of the earliest novels in the world. The Tale of Genji was written in about 1008 by Murasaki Shikibu, her pen name. She was a woman who was born into the ruling Fujiwara family. It reads like a soap opera, but it presented a realistic portrayal of court life. If any of you are fans of Netflix Bridgerton, think of it as Lady Whistledowns, right? But the Japanese, because they were developing their own culture, also developed their own characters for writing their own Japanese language. Now, among many Buddhists in Japan, Korea, and China at this time, there was the shared belief that the world was going to come to an end in the year 1052. There had been various bad omens of late. The capital of Kyoto had suffered outbreaks of disease, and supernova in 1006 didn't help things. It's never a good sign. But when 1052 passed and the world was still intact, the Fujiwara regent converted a private villa in the hills outside Kyoto into a magnificent temple. Inside the Phoenix Hall, as it's called, sits a gilded wood statue of Amida Buddha, created by Joko in 1053, known as the greatest sculptor of his time. Now, instead of being, he's responsible for an important innovation in Japanese sculpture. Now, instead of being carved from a single block of wood, figures could be made larger, made up of numerous pieces of wood that fit together. So here is the sculpture we're talking about. Delicate and serene, Buddha is still there, welcoming the souls of all believers after nearly 1,000 years. We're going to finish our whistle-stop tour of Asia with a look at India, because on the other hand, India actively sought out trade and business relations with China. They even sent commercial and diplomatic envoys to China in the years 1016, 1033, and 1072. Along the east coast of India, a new empire began with the reign of Raja I, whose name means King of Kings. This is the Chola Empire, shown at its greatest extent there in lavender and pink in about the year 1030 under his son's reign. And you see the blue line marking out the trade route to China. How did the Chola Empire succeed so well? Careful management of water resources was key to their success. They learned how to build large storage tanks and irrigation channels to control this precious commodity. By 1000, Hinduism was on the rise, and a glorious achievement of this time in Indians' history are the bronze sculptures made for Hindu rulers and their temples. The Chola Empire was famous for its temple building, and this one pictured here is the largest and tallest of them all, completed in the year 1010 and dedicated to Shiva. And here we have a look at a representation of Shiva Nataraja, Shiva as the Lord of Dance, made in the year 1000. And it's a dance of cosmic importance, the balance between rebirth and death. In Shiva's upper right hand over here, he holds the drum that beats the rhythm of life. In his upper left hand here, he holds a fire, the means of destruction of the world that the world faces. In his lower right hand here, displays the mudra or hand gesture of do not fear. And in his lower left hand, it points down to his foot, and he is trampling upon the embodiment of evil and ignorance. Through believing them, the worshiper will be saved from this endless cycle of rebirth. The expression on Shiva's face here is one of oneness and compassion with the worshiper. Now, we have no written records by the African societies living on that continent in the year 1000, but we do have the words of explorers and traders who visited the area. There are many well-documented African cultures in the year 1000. At that point, the population in Africa was about 40 million. Most of them lived in the sub-Saharan area, but some lived on the East Coast, and that's where we will start our look today. By the time European merchant ships got to this area of the world in the 1400s, they found ancient cities along the East African coast and a well-developed trading system within those cities. They had been trading goods with one another for 1,000 years at that point. What the East Africans wanted were glass beads, silk, cotton cloth, and glazed ceramics like porcelain from as far away as China and India. And in turn, they were trading away ivory, rhinoceros horn, and gold. So in addition to trading goods around the world at this time, languages and crops could also be traded. And here's some examples from the island of Madagascar. We'll step away from the African continent for just a second to look at the island of Madagascar. There, they spoke an Austronesian language that's related to Malaysia, 4,000 miles away, rather than the language related to the east coast of Africa, just 250 miles away. And in Madagascar, they grew Southeast Asian crops. They grew rice and mung beans and cotton. That was not what was being grown in Africa. On the mainland, they grew sorghum, millet, and peas. So those are some of the unusual or unexpected effects of international trade at this time. So trade in Southeastern Africa was largely controlled by the city of Great Zimbabwe, once home to about 18,000 people. Beginning in about the year 1000, residents began to build in stone, creating many buildings of cut granite blocks. The great enclosure, which you see here in an actual photo and here in a reconstruction, is ringed by a masonry wall that's more than 800 feet long, 32 feet tall, and 17 feet thick at its base. But this is not a fortress. There are no battlements. This is instead a royal complex, a palace, and the nucleus of a city that radiated almost a mile out in every direction. Today, the remains of Great Zimbabwe are the largest ancient stone structure in southern Africa. Now, while historians do count on the observations of others from what life was like in Africa all those years ago, not all of it can be taken 100% accurately. For example, in the 900s, a Persian scholar wrote that it was said that beyond the source of the Nile, there was darkness, and beyond the darkness are waters which make gold grow. He said in the country of Ghana, and we're talking about right in here now, he said gold grows in the same way that carrots do. Well, that would be wonderful, but it's not true, of course. But this much is clear. By the year 1000, gold from the ancient empires of Ghana and Mali, they're on a modern map, and here are the more ancient names right in here, this area. Gold from that area of West Africa had become the major source of gold in the world. Some 2/3 of the gold entering Europe and Asia came from that part of the world before 1492 and the discovery and exploitation of the New World. So this map that we're looking at on your screen shows the gold producing areas, nicely picked out in gold, by the way, and the trade routes, the dotted lines across the Sahara Desert. Cities developed along those trade routes, of course, and two of the largest were Timbuktu, right there, and Jenae, right here. These were places that had as many as 20,000 residents. These were great centers of commerce where merchants from all over West Africa met caravans arriving from the northern edge of the Sahara, and the Mediterranean is all the way up at the map. The Sahara Desert, right in here, is a big salt deposit. Towns in the north mined salt and sent it south in caravans along those routes. In the town of Timbuktu, the salt was traded almost weight for gold. The gold was being sent, coming out of these gold producing areas, and was being sent back up north across the Sahara Desert and minted into dinar. And here's an example of an Islamic dinar from the year of 1093. These coins were used all over the Islamic world, and the name comes from the ancient Roman coin, the denarius. In the city of Jenae, you see it right there, and now we'll click on, residents lived in groups based on their work: metal workers, fishermen, potters. Some of the most enigmatic pottery from this period, or really any period in history, are the terracotta figures from Jenae, made between the 1100s and the 1400s. We're not sure what's being represented here. Is it illness? Is it scarification? Or are these in some way supernatural beings shown here? Unfortunately, some researchers believe they may represent illness, and diseases were certainly another commodity that was passed along international trade routes. Sadly, many of these terracotta figures, and you see they're 10, 14 inches tall, most of them, have been removed from their original find sites. And so archaeologists and scholars are really at a loss to understand the context in which these were made and used by the ancient people in Jenae. Now, by the year 1000, the Silk Road trade routes were already hundreds of years old. And because of their importance, we're going to spend a minute talking about them and a minute on about the rise of the Islamic world. The year 1000 falls right in the middle of something scholars call the Islamic Golden Age, between the 700s and the 1300s. Much of the territory on the map that you're looking at right now was under Islamic control at one point or another. And the Golden Age really refers to their advancements in nearly every field: cultural, scientific, and social. Samarkand, that arrow right there pointing out that, was one of the major cities along the Silk Road. And many of these cities were huge. Samarkand alone was home to more than 2,000 residents at the time we're talking about. So what was traveling from the far east, from the right side of your map, basically, to the left side, were items like paper. Samarkand was particularly an important spot for the making of paper. Porcelain, silk, gunpowder from China, which we've talked about. Spices and pearls from Southeast Asia. And even watermelons packed in snow and destined for Baghdad, all the way over here, which had a population of over 1 million people by the year 1000. What was traveling from the left side of your screen to the right side? Well, gold and ivory up out of Africa, slaves, furs, and timber from Eastern Europe, and religions were spreading back and forth as well. Islam, Christianity, and Judaism in particular, coming from this part of the world into the East. If this little apothecary jar could talk, it's about 4 or 5 inches high, the stories it could tell. It was made in Samarkand 1,000 years ago, and the potters there developed this specialized Kufic script, this beautiful script, to use on their pieces. It has a white tin glaze on it. This is not Chinese porcelain, but it's an imitation of it. And it's what they could do in Samarkand along the trade route. The inscription says, modesty comes from faith, and faith comes from paradise. This is a quote attributed to the Prophet Muhammad. In order to travel so successfully in so many different directions, the Arabs, for instance, became excellent navigators, aided by the use of technologies they learned in some cases from others, like the magnetic needle compass that the Chinese knew how to use, but also technologies and information they developed on their own through the study of astronomy. And the most famous Arab cartographer of the time was a man named Muhammad Al-Adrisi. He was based in Sicily, and according to this map, that would be Sicily right there, where he worked in the court of King Roger II. King Roger was a very enlightened ruler. He was open to ideas and cultures and peoples from the Islamic world. This map that Al-Adrisi fashioned contains written descriptions and notations about all these different places all over it that he took from adventurers and merchants' stories. It's a very famous map, and it was printed. There are about 10 more or less complete copies of this famous map still in existence today. Now, the Islamic world, forces and its culture, merchants, they spread all the way across into Western Europe. And these days, Cordoba is ranked as the 12th largest city in Spain. But in the year 1000, Cordoba was home to more people than it is today, as many as 450,000, with 700 mosques and home to 70 libraries within that city. And Cordoba on the map of Spain is right down there. Ancient Greek texts preserved by the Islamic scholars were being translated into Latin. The Arab leaders of the Caliphate of Cordoba brought their study of mathematics and science into Western Europe. Algebra, alchemy, words we use every day, we're entering the Latin language from Arabic. They include words I've used this morning. Coffee at my own home, coffee, sugar, cotton. It all existed somewhat peacefully in Spain, with the Christian states you see shown in yellow there, until the reign of the Caliph Al-Mansur. His armies destroyed the church of Santiago de Compostela right here at the edge, a pilgrimage site known as the resting place of St. James the Apostle. He had parts of that church brought back to Cordoba to build in his expansion of the great mosque that you see pictured here, which was completed in 987. It was the largest sacred building in Europe until St. Peter's was built in Rome in the 1500s. Now, this is as good a place as any to put in a brief word about slave trade around the world in the year 1000. Slave trade was part of all of the cultures we're talking about, as it had been in the ancient world of the Greeks and Romans. So many slaves were taken from one specific area that the term slave is actually derived from the word Slav, the name of the people from that one particular area of Central and Eastern Europe, where so many people were taken. As one author notes, no one saw slavery as anything but an economic necessity. Slaves were reasoned to be outsiders, different. They were others and not part of the civilized world. Muslims and Christians alike simply disregarded the cruelty involved in acquiring slaves. So this takes us on our journey to look a little more closely at Europe. In the year 1000, Western Europe was a Christian world, but the invaders were at the edges. The Vikings to the north, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, the Islamic forces to the south in Spain, which we were just talking about. And then this big pink blob here is like cotton candy, except it's much, much more dangerous than that. That's meant to show where the Magyars, who became Hungarians, the Magyars, those forces were gathered. And all those orange lines throughout, coming out of that pink cloud in every direction, are there to show us some of their incursions, the Magyars' incursions into Western Europe during this time. In the decades leading up to 1000, though, there were some decisive battles and agreements that were made that put an end to some of these threats. In the year 911, one group of Vikings were given northern France, Normandy, to settle down in return for their stopping invading France. Okay, and 955, Otto I, the ruler here in the middle of Europe, defeated the Magyars in what is now Germany and put an end to their expansion into Europe. And then the Muslim Caliphate that we were talking about a minute ago in Spain began to break apart in the year 1031. So the result was that Western Europe in the 1000s began to settle down and enjoy a period of growth and development. In fact, much of the territory became a powerful political entity. Pretty much all that you see shaded in here in these colors became known as the Holy Roman Empire. It was a revival of the Roman Empire from ancient times, growing out of really Charlemagne's reign in 800. And it remained a political, powerful entity and a stable territory for nearly 900 years, only coming to an end in 1806. So trade between the infant countries of Europe increases in the 1000s and the 1100s. And that means that cities and towns grow, and so does the urban class of merchants and artisans. And with that, universities began to spring up. In Bologna in 1088, in Oxford, England in 1096, Salamanca, Spain in 1134, Paris gets its first university in 1160, and in Cambridge, England, 1209. And of course, for comparison, our first is Harvard in the year 1636. So the 1000s became a very active church building period for Western Europe since things were moderately calm. There's a famous quote by a monk from the 1000s describing life in Europe, and he says, "Each people of Christendom rivaled with the other to see which should worship in the finest buildings. The world shook herself," he said, "clothed everywhere in a white garment of churches." So eloquent. Church building was an expression of piety, and so was making a pilgrimage to a holy site. In the 1000s, this practice of pilgrimage dramatically increased. Pilgrims traveled to sites where they could see and venerate relics. They could be the bones or cloth or other materials, something associated with the holy person. And the design of churches being built had to change in response to this. They had to accommodate more people inside the building. So architects created a new style of church. They created this passage here called the ambulatory around the central altar there, so that pilgrims could ambulate around and see the relics and keep moving. And they also developed these radiating chapels. So each of those little chapels there could also have an altar in it and a relic to venerate. Now, we are looking at Conques, and it's where pilgrims came to venerate the remains of Sainte Foy. She was a child martyr who had died hundreds of years before, in the year 303. Her bones have been held at another abbey, but in the 800s, she became the patron saint of the town of Conques, France, after her remains were stolen from the first abbey and brought here for veneration. That sort of thing happened over and over again, and you ask yourself why, and the reason is that pilgrims mean money, and in order to have pilgrims, you had to have some relics. So just saying, that's how that business worked. Now, just an aside, a brief aside about a huge topic, the Crusades. Scholars offer many reasons for the phenomenon that were the Crusades, but we can briefly describe them as large-scale campaigns to liberate important Christian sites in the Holy Land from under the control of Islamic forces. The first one is picked out here in dark purple. It was started in 1096, so it started from a few locations, and their main objective was to liberate and retake Jerusalem right there. It was a success, but the following crusades were less successful in that way, yet they continued over a course of nearly the next 200 years. And there were major ones and minor ones. There really were quite a number of crusades, basically people moving from one spot to another for a brief period of time with an objective. For our topic, there's also kind of an unintended result of people from Western Europe, from the whole England and France and Spain and the Holy Roman Emperor, making their way into and coming in contact with the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic world as well. And the unintended result was that they discovered far more sophisticated cultures than their own back home. They discovered that scholars there were accessing the knowledge of the Greeks and Romans, making new discoveries, and they developed a taste for some of the luxury goods that they saw in use in places like the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic world, things like silks, ivories, pearls, and spices. Now, the British Isles had been susceptible to Viking invasion since the 780s, and it came to a head in the mid-1000s. We know this. The year 1066 sticks in our minds because it's the Norman conquest of England. In the months leading up to that decisive battle, there have been skirmishes at several spots around England. In fact, the English forces beat back the King of Norway and his invaders at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. Just 3 weeks later, they lost it all to William, Duke of Normandy, at the Battle of Hastings, and that changed the course of English history. We're looking at some images from the Bayeux Tapestry. It's a narrative wall hanging 230 feet long. It's not a tapestry at all. Most of you already know that. It's actually an embroidery. And it tells much of the story of William, Duke of Normandy's claim to the English throne, including images of King giving him giving him the title, the throne. But it also documents what life was like in the year 1066. Besides the battle scenes, there are farmers in their fields, there are animals and birds and plants and boats and cooking going on and armor being made. There's also an appearance by Halley's Comet. And again, that's usually considered a bad omen, and it certainly was for the English king. Now let's look at those Vikings. Those seafaring bands of Scandinavians began to descend on Europe as well as the British Isles in the late 700s. They explored, plundered, traded, and colonized over vast areas. From the Baltic Sea, and here you are, here's the Viking homeland over here, there's the Baltic Sea. They took rivers through Eastern Europe and established a new homeland for themselves with major cities at Novgorod, I put an arrow there, and Kiev, so much in our news. There they were called the Rus. The words means, it was just used to describe men who row, as in those boats. They often settled in their places that they invaded. They married, they adopted the culture and the language, they settled down. Now, for some particular ones from Kiev, took their travels into rivers all the way down into the Black Sea. And as they did, it put them on the doorstep of the Byzantine Empire, and that is the city of Constantinople, we now know as Istanbul, right there in red. In 987, the Byzantine emperor in Constantinople needed help because he had invaders at the border, he had usurpers wanting his throne, and he turned to an unlikely group of people for help. He made a deal with the Viking Rus leader, Vladimir the Great, who sent 6,000 men to be an elite guard for the Byzantine emperor. The Vikings turned soldiers were known as the Varangian Guard. And we can see Viking graffiti in Hagia Sophia today. You can see it largely in this panel here, and there's a close-up there. Maybe even scratched by a couple of Varangian when they had a moment's break, written in Old Norse runes on this monument. Now, there's another aspect of our lives which features every day that really can trace its way back to the Vikings and to the year about 1000. Many of us recognize this symbol. It's the Bluetooth symbol. In the 960s, the Danish king Harald Bluetooth united Denmark and gained control of Norway. Now, the Erikson and Intel engineers chose to call their new technology Bluetooth because it brought computers and mobile phones together, just as the way Harald had united two countries into his new kingdom. Let's keep going with the Vikings because, as we can see, they began taking longer sea voyages. This time we'll talk about their westward exploits. The Vikings developed different ships for different types of water, rivers, seas, and oceans. Generally, the boats featured a shallow keel with square sails, and they learned how to use those sails to tack into the wind. The ships were often carved in the same decorations found in Norse churches, interlace animals and plants, abstract patterns, and spirals. By the year 1000, Oslo, Kiev, York, and Dublin were all large Viking towns. In the North Atlantic, the Vikings settled Iceland in 870, and they moved on to Greenland by 982, where Eric the Red founded a settlement. And in the year 1000, Leif Erikson's son, and this is a reconstruction of Leif Erikson's house in Iceland. And I joke and say this is one of his neighbors, but truly this man is probably descended from Leif Erikson's neighbors. He has the farm next door. Most people, by the year 1000, most researchers agree that Leif Erikson landed in North America and called the place Vinland. Most people believe it was at Langsea Meadows in Newfoundland where the Vikings found fertile land, grass, and fish, and this is a reconstruction of that at Langsea Meadows. They built structures of wood, they spent the winter, and Leif returned to Greenland without meeting any of the native Amur Indians. A few years later, his brother Thorvald went to Vinland, but he died in an encounter with the natives. A third Viking trip went to Langsea Meadows and spent 3 years at the site. They probably didn't have such great relationship with the locals either. They built a very strong fence, bigger than this one, around their settlement. The scholars think that the Vikings left because they figured they'd never get the best of the locals who knew the land and the climate so well. But at Langsea Meadows, the Vikings left just a few pieces of scant evidence that they'd been there: a bronze cloak pin and the remains of an iron smithy. That's an anvil stone and some iron fragments where they had been working. And that's significant because the native population wasn't smelting iron. The Vikings were. But all told, it was a very short occupation of North America. The Vikings went home. So scientists have identified a period of warmer temperatures that affected much of the Earth's surface between the years 900 and 1300. And they call it the medieval warm period. And we're looking at this orange triangle blob right here on this timeline. The warmer temperatures caused the seas to be warmer, crops to grow more abundantly, and populations to surge in many parts of the world. Now, once crops and animals are domesticated successfully, cultures can thrive. Cities can be built, they can have more children. Usually they develop a written language, they create wealth. That could take centuries, of course, to get it right. And that's if everything goes according to as right as they would like it to. But the warmer temperatures of the medieval warm period may mean that some cultures got the combination right and others didn't. Some were successful for centuries and then maybe couldn't sustain it, as drought and famine were eventually brought on by too much warmth. What this means for our look at the Americas, which is next, is that some societies were large and some were small. Some had writing and others didn't. This helps explain why there could be such differences, because they didn't have all of the pieces put together at the same time properly. So in the Americas, Central and Southern America had more success with the right combination of crops and animals for large cultures to develop, like the Maya, and thrive there. But smaller cultures developed in North America. And yet all three areas, North, Central, and South America, were linked by trade, as the archaeologists have uncovered. In North America, evidence of one early culture is easy to spot. It's just 10 miles outside of St. Louis. The Cahokia historical site features a large mound still standing 100 feet high. It's the largest pre-colonial structure in North America. It was created by people we know as the Mississippian culture because their towns and settlements ranged from the Great Lakes down through the eastern middle of the country to the Gulf of Mexico. The site Cahokia, and you see artists' interpretation or impression of what it might have been, once featured this central mound right there, plus smaller mounds, maize gardens, quarries, houses, hospitals, plazas, sweat lodges, an area covering about 6 square miles. And Cahokia was home to as many as 30,000 people. Now, the large mound at Cahokia was begun around 950, and it rose in stages. A temple or palace would have been at the top of it, right up there. It sits on a base that's larger than that of the Great Pyramid of Egypt. And one estimate is that it would have taken about 1,000 men working every day for 6.5 years to pile up that much earth. The residents of Cahokia were trading with other cultures, as we said, up and down the Mississippi, Missouri, and Illinois rivers. They traded for copper jewelry, mica, pearls, shells, and even shark's teeth from Florida. I mean, we've all wanted that souvenir, right? Now, in the Southwest, we see how societies were developing there. What remains today are the ruins of Pueblo Bonita, not far from Santa Fe, New Mexico. It reached its apex in about 1100, and it was the capital of a vast trade empire of settlements along this canyon, Chaco Canyon. Here at Pueblo Bonita, the residents built a collection of over 800 rooms clustered around this central courtyard, their plaza, and it was home to as many as 10,000 people at its height. The residents traded goods with others in the area, and they maintained a system of roads that linked more than 20 other pueblos in a 150-mile radius. Their roads were often as straight as Roman roads and 30 feet wide, but the residents at Pueblo Bonita didn't have pack animals and they didn't use wheeled vehicles. In order to keep the roads straight, they even used ramps and steps to go up over hills as they needed to. They could have been using, and certainly were using, the roads to transport goods by foot, but they also may have been ritual paths. They are so precise, and we may never know exactly why. The people at Pueblo Bonita imported turquoise from 100 miles away, which they then worked into jewelry and pieces that they traded further up the line for the things that they wanted. They wanted abalone from the Pacific Ocean. They wanted shells from the Gulf of Mexico and copper and birds like macaws from Mexico. So as we shift our gaze towards Central America, we uncover at this time the Maya in their post-classic phase. The Maya developed an advanced knowledge of mathematical concepts, including the concept of zero. They created their own system of hieroglyphs, about 800, that's similar to ancient Egyptian. And they practiced advanced agricultural techniques that meant they could grow crops, even in tropical rainforests. Their rulers linked their power to the gods in elaborate rituals that included bloodletting and human sacrifice. Chichen Itza was the largest city in the Americas with a population of nearly 40,000. Today, we see its many well-preserved buildings there, the impressive Castillo, the four-sided pyramid. If you count all the steps on each of the four sides, plus the top platform step, it equals the number 365. That's because they were making observations and discoveries from places like the Caracol, their observatory, where they were taking astronomical readings of planets, eclipses, and using those things to develop the Maya calendar system. And we're going to end our worldwide tour in South America. Let's meet the Chimu culture. They lived and flourished along 600 miles of coastline in Peru before being conquered by the Inca. They were an artistic society, and each of their towns' artists made up the majority of the population. Their pottery features a shiny black glaze. Oops, sorry, hold on. And it was achieved by firing at a high temperature. This vessel is known as a whistling jar because it makes a sound like a bird chirping. And in this case, when the liquid is swished around from one chamber to another, we get that sound. Now, unfortunately, I don't see my icon. Oh, shoot, excuse me just a second. Oh, my little icon for sound has gone off the page. I'm terribly sorry, but there is a way. I will tell you if you go to the Metropolitan Museum of Art's website.
Mary, why don't you try to make the noise on your own?
No, you are so funny. It sounds like a chirping, whistling bird. Everybody use your imagination for that. I don't know where my little arrow went, but there we go, a technical fail there. Anyway, the Chimu made things like this chirping bird vase. They made rattles, they made trumpets. Archaeologists aren't sure if they were simply toys for children's amusements or were they ceremonial instruments, but they were very sophisticated things made 1,000 years ago by the Chimu people. Well, so now we have made our, oh, hold on just a sec. Let's give it a second. No, okay, never mind. Now we have made our way. There we go. There we go. I hope everybody got to hear that. So, we've made our way around the world at a look at the year 1000. There are some spots we may have to just save for another trip. I know the year 1000 seems like very long ago, but much of what humans achieved then is still with us today. Maybe you spent some of your COVID lockdown time catching up on reading. If you chose to read Beowulf, for instance, well, its earliest version dates to 1000, or perhaps you thought of something a little more swashbuckling like 1001 Arabian Nights. That was compiled in the late 900s. Or maybe you played a game of chess with somebody. That Indian game became a huge hit when it arrived with Arab merchants into Europe in the year 1000. So if we really could go back in time, we might find ourselves feeling more at home than we think. So thank you very much. I'll stop there. And if anybody has any questions or comments, I'm more than happy to take them. Thank you.
Mary, wonderful job, as expected. So folks, if you have any questions or comments for Mary, now is the time. I know we're just about out of time, but we can take 5 minutes of questions or comments.
Good.
Let's see here. I don't see any quite yet.
Okay.
couple of people were amused by our technical difficulties, but hey, what are you going to do?
Well, yes, it worked in the end.
So Francis says, thank you, Mary.
Oh, thank you.
And I apologize in advance for any names I butcher. Rekha says, thank you. Chris says, thanks. Sigit says, wow, fabulous history lecture. Tom says, superb presentation.
That's very kind, everybody. Thank you.
Lois says, thank you, Mary. A lot of info. Rekha says, thank you for your lecture. It was informative and such a pleasure to listen to your research. Have a wonderful afternoon. Ron says, so interesting. Angela says, thank you, Mary. Learned a lot. Diane, and Diane means business. We got capital letters. Very interesting. Thank you. Teresa, so interesting to learn about so much history. Well, I don't see any questions, just effusive praise. So Roland says, a whirlwind tour through history and art. Right. Thank you.
You're right about the whirlwind. I think we'll all catch our breaths, but thank you for putting up with that. And it's just that there is a lot of ground to cover, but you all were good sports. Thank you so much.
So Mary, I'm going to put you on the spot. Let me see. Do I have it? I do have it here. Okay. So Mary will be back with us in a month, in 4 weeks, 4 weeks from today on Thursday, May 12th at 11 o'clock. For Tulip Mania and Dutch flower painting. You want to take 30 seconds and briefly talk about that?
Absolutely, I do. Some of you, we've all heard of how crazy Tulip Mania, the buying of tulip bulbs was in the 1600s, that people would pay as much as what a whole entire home was worth for a single bulb. So I want to look at some of those extreme stories, and we'll discover what was really happening, and we'll actually kind of relate it to practices we think might, speculative practices we think today might be a little nuts, like people spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on non-fungible tokens, NFTs. But we'll look at the society that created those beautiful paintings, and also the sort of manic craze for owning and distributing those lovely flowers that were the topics of those beautiful Dutch paintings.
It's funny you mentioned NFTs, Mary. We're actually going to be doing a program on those in June.
There you go.
All the things I want to learn about, cryptocurrency and
exactly. I mean, they're in our world, NFTs, and we might as well try to get some handle on understanding them, even if we're never going to be spending $1 million on them ourselves. There you go. So it's just, it's a beautiful lecture, by the way. If you like flowers and don't care a thing about the rest of it, you'll still come in and spend an enjoyable hour looking at those beautiful Dutch paintings.
And for those of you who live locally here in Tewksbury or the Merrimack Valley, we'll be doing some in-person, yes, I said in-person, gardening and flower related programs in May. So keep an eye out for those as well. So anyway, Mary, thank you so much. I want to thank the libraries in Andover and Groton for partnering with Tewksbury. Want to thank the 50 or so folks who came out on a Thursday, or I guess stayed in on a Thursday morning to listen to us. And Mary, great job. We'll see you in 4 weeks.
Thank you. Thanks so much, everybody. Bye-bye.
All right, look for that email tomorrow, folks. Feedback survey recording and information about Mary's next talk. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.